Hey everyone, this is Matt from Slam Sector, and you're in the pipe with 5x5, the podcast where we explore the things that make wargaming so special. Today we're going to be talking about what I've been calling novel gameplay, and I'll get into why I call it novel gameplay and why it's distinctly different from, let's say, casual versus narrative gameplay, but it borrows elements from that. Anyway, before we get going, be sure to like this episode, and if you're not subscribed, it's a great way to help us out and support the show. Also, be sure to check us out on socials and join in the discussion in Discord, all of which will be linked below. Here to chat with me today is Ryan from Slam Sector as well. You may have seen him in previous games. Ryan, welcome to the show.
What's up? How's it going?
Living the dream, baby. All day, every day.
Let's start talking about some weird games.
Hell yeah, man. Hell yeah. You and I have done quite a few of these, what I'm calling novel games. So you felt like exactly the right person to tag in on this to kind of explore this concept with folks. What I wanted to do first off was kind of figure out a definition for what I would call narrative versus casual versus novel, right?
Right.
And it's a super blurry line. I would say that, like, for me, novel gameplay includes stuff like what the core book currently in 9th edition, as we're recording right now, that this current version of the game, has as what it calls narrative. So it's kind of like a misnomer almost, right? The Crusade system for narrative feels like novel gameplay to me. But narrative, when I think of it, is like a set story campaign that you run through. Maybe it even has like a neutral third-party dungeon master, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. How would you explore those differentiations there?
So yeah, narrative gameplay is an interesting area of gameplay because it can kind of skirt the line between being more in line with regular core gameplay, and then you can get some weird rules in there. For me, you have like match play where everything's by the book. You use all the rules, like secondaries, all the detachment stuff and everything. You have more casual play where you still are like using the rules and you're following them for the most part, but you might like drop sections of the game. Like you might drop secondaries. Like I've played games with people like that, and you might not worry as much about detachments, but you're still really just kind of staying in the boundaries of the core rules. And then you get into like novel stuff where you're adding in rules. You're adding in just weird scenarios, strange objectives. Maybe you're pulling things from old editions, pulling things from other tabletop games, or like ideas from video games even, and you're kind of inventing. It's that sort of innovation and invention part of it, to me, that makes like novel gameplay. And narrative has some of that, and can definitely have elements of that.
Absolutely.
And Crusade is kind of like a GW sanctioned sort of novel gameplay that they've added in 9th, right? It was new in 9th, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to say that something like it kind of lived in the 2nd edition of Age of Sigmar, and then it seems like that kind of test bedded out and then came into 9th edition, 40k. And you and I have played like a metric ton of Crusade games, just with a group. I want to say that one of the main things that we did, like when 9th first dropped, it was myself, you, and then like I think like a floating amount of like 6 or 7 other folks that we just went through all the missions and just kept our Crusade list, our roster, growing and it was called Order of Battle, right? The Order of Battle sheet, just growing and growing and growing. And dude, some of those things stacking with other things, interacting with rules that were never intended to interact with either of those things, like from the core book, it was wacky. It got pretty bonkers at the end there.
you could get some pretty degenerate combinations going, especially once you got several games in. You had a lot of requisition. Yeah, requisition is what they called the resource. But yeah, that was fun. I would definitely that was something that's kind of like in the realm of narrative somewhat. We kind of had a narrative, if I remember right, but it wasn't like a very story driven sort of series of battles. We just kind of fought people as they were available.
Yeah,
And
it got to the point kind of where like I remember, oh shit, I think it was like my Space Marine captain kept getting killed by a bloodthirster with like a massive amount of points, and so an emergent nemesis kind of system arrived every time I would play the Corn player, right? It was pretty cool, but that we just stumbled into. That wasn't something that we were planning on, right?
right, was that a built-in system, the whole Nemesis thing, or was that something that just kind of you like made that bloodthirster your nemesis? Because I know some of the armies have rules like that.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a specific nemesis system. I was just like, yeah, that bloodthirster. You know, this is going to be the fourth game where that bloodthirster is like chewing his way through my army to kill my captain. I need to kill that bloodthirster. A, it made sense tactically in the game because the bloodthirster was on a warpath, and B, it just added to the flavor. Like, of course,
yeah,
you know, this captain would be beefing with with this massive bloodthirster, right? So it kind of emerged out of the gameplay almost accidentally, and then you're talking about it, and you're like, yeah, I guess he has killed that guy like 4 times now, huh? So it's just fun.
That's one of the things I like about extended campaign sort of games in tabletop wargaming is that sort of emergent content that you develop, like the rivalries between different generals and stuff. But it's a lot of fun.
Now there's a campaign that you, I think, just wrapped up that I wasn't able to really jump in on, but I am definitely envious. It incorporates Risk, the board game, right?
Yeah, so a local game store, some of the people there bravely, I would say, decided to just like try to make a campaign system using Risk as the basis. And the essential concept is, if you're not familiar with Risk, in Risk you move armies around like a world map between different sort of continental regions, and you build up armies of like pieces, and then you move them to other territories. And in the normal game, you roll dice based on the numbers of guys you have there, and that's how you fight. In this campaign system, rather, every piece that was like an army, quote unquote, was a certain value of points for a 40k battle. And so you would have a campaign map where generals were deciding where they were going to move their forces around the map, where they were going to attack, etc. And then however many of those armies collided with enemy armies, that would be the points distribution of a battle, which is very interesting because you get some very lopsided battles, like thousands of points versus 500 points. And it definitely needs some modification from like core Risk rules, and like it's sort of been like a beta test for the campaign system in this first iteration. We're working on developing the rules. I'm actually helping out a little bit with like the map for the next iteration, so it should be pretty fun. But yeah, it's been going on for like a couple of months now, I want to say.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So there's no like there wasn't a specific end in sight. It's just you play until like the meta game of Risk is resolved, right?
Yeah. So I can't remember how. I want to say there is an end condition to Risk. It's been so long since I've played like regular Risk, I can't remember. But we didn't.
Yeah, same here.
They didn't really have an end condition in mind. They were like, "Hey, let's try this and see what happens." It was very like they didn't have like win conditions per se. There sort of came a point where you could tell one faction had gotten so big and had such like a industry for pumping out armies that they were basically going to win, and we could drag it out, or we could just call it, and that's kind of what happened. We did try to make an alliance against them, but it crumbled, like alliances in 40k do.
Sure, of course.
But yeah, some factions got wiped out, and when they got wiped out, they got absorbed by other factions if they wanted to. So like people weren't like eliminated from the gameplay if they wanted to keep playing. So that was nice.
Fascinating. Yeah, that is nice. What were some of the challenges that you ran into with incorporating like disparate rules on the metagame of Risk the board game versus Warhammer, and like how did the group try and react to that?
So the core Risk rules, like your army economy, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
You like divide the number of territories you have. And then it's also based off of continents. Like if you control a continent, you get a certain amount of armies. Yeah. And we changed that to just be a flat, however many territories, or I say they changed it to be a flat number of territories increases your number of armies. Because just like the sort of economy for Risk that worked for Risk didn't really create enough points. It made like weird point values when you were dividing it down. You're getting like 200 points a turn, and the armies were very small and kind of cumbersome. Because like if you're too small of a force in 40k, it kind of becomes hard to put together a coherent force sometimes. We wanted to aim towards like maybe around 1,000 as the smallest sort of attacking force, I guess. Okay. But so yeah, they changed that. I wasn't intimately involved in all the decision-making process of running the game because I was just a player, so I don't know all their reasons. But this is sort of my perception of the decision-making process. But yeah, they changed that. There was a lot of rules adjudication for how armies would collide on the map because in Risk it's all turn-based, but in this all the moves are happening simultaneously. They didn't want to have like an initiative system, or like a turn system. They thought it'd be more fair to have it, be simultaneous. And so there was game design issues that had to be tackled because of that.
I remember one thing that you were talking to me about, like kind of early on. It was like probably early on in the campaign where technically two armies would get into a battle, but they were kind of forced into a battle and they had an alliance. And so it would be a Warhammer game where both armies would just march to the other side. And it's like, are you going to shoot? No, I'm not going to shoot unless you're going to shoot. I'm not going to shoot you. And then you guys would just uneasily pass while aiming guns and then cross the other board sides.
Yeah, so there were some weird situations that happened with alliances in particular, because there was also, they added in a completely new rule system that's not in Risk at all to like get bonus armies, like secondary objectives. And some of the objectives would be things like do a ritual at the center of the battlefield, or get a unit to the center of the battlefield, or sort of have your HQ survive. And so sometimes if you're allied with somebody, you might collide in like moving around the map, because you could never abandon a territory. That was a key thing. So like if I wanted to move a force across a friendly allied territory to attack like our target, I would technically have to fight battles against my ally. And so then we would have these 40k battles where it's like we're each trying to get our secondary objectives. We're just kind of like walking guys around the board. It was interesting.
That sounds like a beautiful mess, though. I mean, that's the kind of thing that kind of happens when you do this kind of thing. From what I've experienced and from what I can tell of you and other folks that have done this kind of thing, you got to be ready to do iterations, right? That growth process is definitely involved there. There's an interesting Crusade campaign of sorts, because we knew where it was ended, that I played very recently, actually. And it involved Mark from the Template Institute. Mark, shout out. We called this the Great Northern Crusade, right? Because he was all the way up in Canada, and it was a haul to get up there, but we did it. So what we did is we played all the missions straight through in a set amount from one what's it called? Crusade book, right? So these Crusade books have specific missions in them that are non-standard. They're not like what you would see in match play missions. So Beyond the Veil was the Crusade book that we played. And we started from one mission and just played all the way through. And it built a pretty cool narrative there. And there were like different currencies that you got if you won the game. There was some narrative stuff that spawned out of my stuff. So I brought Nurgle Demons to that. And one of the things that my Nurgle Demons were obsessed with were truffles, right? And the reason why they're obsessed with truffles is because I was trying to figure out a way to justify just how many Beasts of Nurgle I was running in a list. And I was like, well, why the hell would they bring so many Beasts of Nurgle? And I was like, okay, maybe these things can smell something out. And then I was like, okay, they're like truffle hogs. They smell truffles and they want to dig them up. And we're getting, rumors of truffles in this sector, right? So my army had a narrative and it had a reason to be playing in these non-standard campaigns. And I actually later on in the campaign introduced this little like pewter green imp looking guy who I called the Harvester, right? And so we had like his little demon devil poker, but I called that a truffle spade, right?
Nice. And
so
the
his
truffles
job
in this context were like a demonic energy source, right?
Yeah. So basically what I would a truffle to Nurgle in my lore was basically like a soul that had been lost and had become corrupted under the influence of Nurgle and was coalescing and basically coagulating underground into this like truffle, right? Like super demonic shit, super Nurgle shit, just like, working great. And so every time I would field the unit Feculent Gnarlmaw, right, which is like a fortification that I'm able to bring in my army, I would also bring like this. He costs 0 points and he can't affect the game in any matched play sense, but he has the same stats as like a Plague Bearer hero, like the Poxbringer or something. He can't cast any spells. He doesn't have any guns or anything. His job was to get to the Feculent Gnarlmaw if it was still around, because it can be destroyed, and harvest a truffle and then make it off the side of the battlefield. If I did that fast enough, I would make him come onto the battlefield from another side, grab another truffle and make it off, right? So I had to physically run these truffles. And
that's very, very novel. That falls directly into like what I would call the novel gameplay in like the definitions.
Yeah, sure.
Like weird mechanics you're adding into the game to add like a little extra spice. No pun intended, since it's truffles,
Exactly. I could shave the truffles into that. But we ran into a hitch because I wasn't planning on figuring out what to do if the friggin' Feculent Gnarlmaw got shot off the table, right? And so I'm playing Mark, and he dumps both Rogel Dorns all barrels into the Feculent Gnarlmaw, and it immediately evaporates. And so my little lore character is just like, oh no. And so what I did is I was like, Mark, I have to go to my lore character has to go to the site where the truffle tree was, and if I roll a 4-up on a d6 with him doing an action, which there's rules obviously in 40k for actions, he has to perform an action, and on a 4-up he finds a truffle that was at the ruins of the tree. Mark was like, no, it should be a 6 because I destroyed it, and I was like, we'll split the difference. It'll be a 5-up. So there's like, go ahead.
He's just out there like Agent Origin your truffle trees, and you're just trying to make an honest living for Papa Nurgle.
And so this game is raging, right? Great Unclean Ones are dying and melting into piles of goo. Frogs are eating entire chimeras. And my little harvester is sitting there desperately digging to find a truffle, and like I couldn't find the 5, and it was so fucking funny, man. Oh,
now, could he kill the harvester in your rules?
So what we said was, if a tank has a clear shot, then he can make lore shots at my lore character, right? On top of regular match play shots. And we made that rule. And then he promptly never shot at me with the lore rules. So, Mark, if you're listening, you forgot to shoot at my harvester. I like to think that you did it out of mercy, that you realized it was a humanitarian mission. But such is the game.
He took out the resource, and then he wasn't aiming for civilian collateral damage. If someone who lives in Nurgle's garden can be called a civilian,
all right. I mean, it's open to interpretation, and I got a feeling any good Imperial would not interpret it that way. So, but
Yeah, probably not.
yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. It was pretty good stuff.
Yeah, I wish I could have made it up there for that, but there will always be next time.
Oh yeah. We're gonna be doing Revenge of the Northern Crusade. We're gonna have him down in America. We're gonna do an American Crusade. It's gonna be great.
Now, did Jordan have any special like extra rules for his? He took World Eaters, correct?
Yeah. So Jordan was rocking World Eaters, and he was collecting skulls basically. So Angron was on a warpath and just taking.
I mean, skulls are the truffles of corn, essentially.
I'll give you that all day. Yeah. So you and your brother used to play when y'all were pretty young, and y'all came up with all sorts of wild stuff you told me about.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, me and my brother and I, for Mark, we have been doing like gaming for a pretty long time, but we had to be kind of innovative for a number of reasons. Like my mom, she was a wonderful mother, but she was very scared of her boys getting exposed to like violent video games and things like D&D. So like we kind of there was like a ban on like gun toys or anything that had like shooting for a long time. But we watched things like Transformers, which they had guns in there kind of. And we were able to at one point sort of use that as a way to get into tabletop wargaming because we discovered BattleTech. And it's, to a parent, you look at a Transformer, you look at a Battle Mech, they're pretty similar. And so when we wanted to get BattleTech, they're like, okay, maybe this will occupy you and, you'll leave us alone so we can think and sleep. And you can focus on that. And when we got BattleTech, that was like our first introduction to tabletop wargaming. We had never really done anything like that. The closest we had done to like anything like that would have been like, playing with our Lego characters and, things we built. But that introduced us to the concept of like having rules and dice and things. But you got to remember, like back in this time period, there was no internet. There weren't a lot of game stores. So we had like our singular BattleTech box, and that was basically all the resource we had for a long time. And we had to just kind of come up with our own scenarios and rules and things. And that got us started on sort of that, innovation, coming up with our own game sort of concept. Because they also had a bunch of like flyers in there for other games that we had no way of getting a hold of, like Shadowrun, Earth Dawn, and it was very fascinating to us because like we were raised, even though our mom didn't want us playing D&D, our dad would read us Lord of the Rings. He'd read us Starship Troopers, even though we weren't supposed to play with guns. We would watch Star Wars and like David Lynch's Dune and all this stuff. So we had all that kind of ideas bouncing around our head, but no outlet for it.
Okay.
And BattleTech got us going on that. And BattleTech was also it sort of like broke the seal on like tabletop wargaming. And from there, we were able to get into like GW stuff, like Battlemaster. I don't know if you're familiar with Battlemasters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. For those of you who may not know what Battlemaster was, it was essentially old world Warhammer, but just very simplified. You had like Chaos Warriors, Beastmen, Orcs, Bretonnian Knights, Empire, cannons, and stuff. And it was this big hex grid map with like a tower, and you would like do little scenarios on it. And we got a hold of that. We started doing like our own scenarios, and it came with a ton of miniatures. Like BattleTech came with a few miniatures, and they were okay, but the quality wasn't really great. But the Battlemaster's miniatures were pretty detailed for the time and looked a lot better than the BattleTech. And so from that experience, we got very interested in like miniatures, and we just started buying miniatures. We didn't really know what we were buying necessarily. We saw something cool, we would buy it, and then we'd figure out a way to play with it. And that got us started. And then we eventually got a hold of a few Space Marines. I remember there was a game store finally opened up near where we lived, and we went out there, and I was going in to get like paint, which back then it was what kind of enamel paint was what we were using, which is a lot harder to work with than like the current paints. You had to use like mineral spirits and stuff, but killed quite a few brain cells probably. But yeah, so I was going in the game store, and I was just looking to see like if they had a battle mech miniature or like a goblin or someone with like, you know, like a warrior or something, because we liked painting them at that point. And then I saw, I think it was the Space Marine Firebase, and I was like, what in the world is this? And I'd kind of gotten a dose of the sort of grimdark idea of like a sci-fi setting from, what was it, Mutant Chronicles from Warzone. Are you familiar with like Warzone and the Mutant Chronicles and all that? They were kind of a competitor to Warhammer 40k, I want to say, for a little while, but they just didn't do they weren't as successful. But anyway, I saw the Space Marines. I started buying a bunch of Space Marine miniatures, and my brother and me, we had like all these miniatures. We had the idea of like tabletop wargaming from Battle Masters and from BattleTech. And at one point, my parents bought us Dragon Strike, which was really funny because that's essentially light D&D, even though we weren't allowed to play D&D. So we had all these maps, these grid maps. And so we would just sit around and come up with like weird little sort of dungeon crawl games that we'd play. Kind of like Kill Team almost, or like boarding actions that we have now for 40k. And then when we eventually found out that 40k was a game, even though we had like miniatures for it, we just fell headfirst into that. We got the 3rd edition box set, and we started playing 40k, but we didn't have a lot of miniatures to use, so we had to get creative with like our battles and our scenarios.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, what were some of the battles or scenarios that you remember that really stuck out for y'all that y'all would homebrew up, basically?
So, it was kind of hard for us to get a hold of miniatures because we had like allowances that weren't great, and you know, miniatures were cheaper back then, but they were still expensive to us. So we would get interested in army, and we might have like, I think at one point I had like a Hive Tyrant and like 10 Termagants. My brother had like a handful of Eldar Guardians and a Warlock, and it wasn't really enough to fight. And we had played a bunch of this sort of like dungeon crawl stuff in the past. And so I would like sit down and draw out grid maps for like interiors of buildings, because we also didn't have terrain. The way we used to make terrain was we had a pool table with like a cover that was yellow. It looked kind of like sand, and we would stick books under the pool cover and make hills with it. And that was the best terrain we could get. Until I started drawing like grid maps of like building interiors. And a thing we liked to play was I would like set up all these buildings in this like desert terrain, and I would put blips out. Very reminiscent of like the current Genestealer cult rules. Like I'd put a token inside the buildings, and then once he got line of sight on a token, I would like roll a die, and it would be revealed what it was. And so like I, as the Tyranid player, didn't actually know what my distribution was. So like he could come around a corner, and he could either find a Termagant or a Hive Tyrant. And it was all up to chance. It was very weird, probably very unbalanced. Because we weren't too concerned with points. We were just like putting the miniatures we had out on the table. Yeah. And I think, if I remember correctly, he was trying to get to like an ammo crate or like a little reactor core, because we had like a few little plastic like objective markers that I think came with the 3rd edition box set, but I'm not entirely sure. We may have bought those second from that through like a White Dwarf mail order, which is how we used to get bits and stuff. We would mail away money in an envelope and then they would mail us back our models.
Oh man.
But yeah, that was like some of the early sort of, I guess, novel gameplay. It was born out of like desperation to like have fun with the game and a lack of resources, and just sort of being open to like inventing your own fun, which I think is like, it's a pretty important part of the game, even when you're playing in a more rigid setting. Like, sort of embracing that sort of emergent gameplay and like emergent ideas in narratives is like part of the hobby at all levels, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things that you even see Games Workshop doing, right? Where that idea of blips of a force, and not kind of like the 3-card Monty happening. Sometimes a double blind 3-card Monty going on, where neither people know what's behind the token is it's really cool that you guys came up with that, as well as, I want to say it was like it was either a White Dwarf or like a little tiny board game that Games Workshop came out with in like the early 2000s. And it was like this, I think it was like a board game box that you could buy, and it kind of existed to sell miniatures, because I got a feeling that they could sell miniatures through board game models easier in certain districts or whatever than they could just selling like raw kits. Mm-hmm. And so it was like a hex board with Space Marine Scouts, like 5 Space Marine Scouts, and like an 8-pack of Gene Stealers. And the hex board was like this jungle, and you would make it to it was like a random shuffled deck of hexes, right? And inside the hex there were like smaller hexes. And anytime you touched the edge of one hex, you would randomly reveal another hex piece that had more of the board, right? So the board would change every single time you do it. And you're trying to like escape and survive with the scouts, and the Gene Stealers kill you like 19 times out of 20. But one time when you survive, oh my god. It's glorious, right? So, I mean, asymmetric gameplay is one of those things that's obviously going to emerge, because it's A, boring, or B, impossible to truly homebrew interesting symmetrical gameplay. So embracing that chaos and embracing that that asymmetry and kind of putting the design in that is something that is a lot of fun, and I think kind of is at the heart of this like novel gameplay experience that we're kind of just shooting this stuff about.
It's definitely like especially if you're making stuff up just on your own, it's hard to get like a balance. And so you have to be open to, this is not going to be fair for one person, but the chance and the idea and the situation where they succeed against the odds is so exciting, and should be exciting for like both sides, because you're kind of like collaborating on the events that happen on the board is the best way to look at it, as opposed to competing. Anything that's outside of like match play, I think, should be looked at as a collaboration instead of a competition. You're like developing a story. But yeah.
It's good stuff, man. I mean, like, so early in my Warhammer career, I was obsessed with the Kill Team. All right. And this is the Kill Team 2018 version, where like, it was like mini 40K, and it didn't have a whole lot of balance to it. But, one of the things that I remember exploring with that was PvE rules. So basically, like, there was like an AI flow chart for the opposing faction, and they would spawn in random spots, and they would perform these actions if things were in certain distances, or if things weren't in certain distances, they would like advance and go this far and everything. And it was really interesting, and it reminded me of this even more interesting system in an entirely different game. It was X-Wing. So X-Wing had like a very deep what's the word I'm looking for? AI rule set. Yeah, AI rule set and campaign that you could play solo if you wanted to. And I remember starting to kind of like peek under the hood of that, but then I kind of like lost my motivation with with X-Wing, and then found that the real itch that I was trying to scratch was Warhammer. But
Yeah,
it's super cool.
Right towards the end of the our X-Wings days is when I started talking to you about Warhammer, and we both fell back into it.
Yeah,
and dragged a bunch of other people with us.
Yeah.
But yeah, that X-Wing thing was like a whole. It was like a whole narrative campaign with like missions, and it had like didn't it have like a mission tree that you would go down depending on how you did.
Yeah,
I never actually got a chance to play it.
It was, I only did like a few games of it, and it was me just like, basically, it feels like you're playing solitaire when you play that game by yourself versus AI, because that's kind of what you're doing. But I was shocked at how effectively it functioned, because, it's easy to write, it's not really code, I guess it is code, like analog code for those AI controlled ships when you have the X-Wing like turn dial, right? When you start to have like the free motion of things, real players are obviously going to position in certain ways and use like, maybe they won't use all of their advanced roll versus an AI that if you just write it in a simple way, it'll use every bit of its advanced roll and leave itself wide out in the open to be shot, like that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. Like it is analog coding, and like it works well with X-Wing because they have a very discrete set of actions they can take and movements they can take.
Yeah,
it'd be a lot harder with 40K, but I mean, you could figure out a system. You just have to kind of like narrow down the parameters of what they can do.
True. But yeah, so I'm kind of obsessed with random generators. It's so much fun to me. Like, I want to say, like, I got when Minecraft first was in like beta, right? I remember playing it with friends, and we did the server and everything. And eventually, I like stopped building anything I cared about, but I was absolutely obsessed with exploring random stuff, right? And I remember that just like sticking in my head. And one of the things that I've always kind of struggled, not really struggled with, but wanted to make more appealing in 40K is terrain, right? So I've always wanted terrain to be asymmetrical, but as fair as possible. And like, that's really hard to do, right? Asymmetry and fairness are opposed.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to figure out. We definitely have tried a couple of times in our group. You did most of the work for that.
Yeah, there was. I came up with a whole random terrain placement generator where you would roll dice and certain terrain pieces would generate. But if like one side was just getting all the crazy ruins, the game or the generator would catch itself and then put something else there instead, depending on parameters. And I had multiple iterations of it. It looked pretty cool. Like, I was happy with it, but it had that kind of, if you're playing like No Man's Sky a whole lot and you just keep seeing the same random placements over and over again, like it was random to a degree, but the variety didn't feel very random. It felt kind of same, but
trend towards certain layouts. Familiar layouts.
Exactly. At the end of the day, though, I was happy with it as far as I got with it. It was a fun little side project, really, and we were feeding that into the Eternal Crusade thing that we were playing. So it was casual novel on homebrew novel concept. And I mean, shit, you could even do that with a hypothetical Risk Hammer game, right? So you could have novelty on top of novelty on top of novelty. So
you can stack them up and have a very strange campaign.
Yeah.
I kind of, GW used to have sort of more novel missions in their rulebook, and in White Dwarves, which they might still have some of them. I know we did the boarding action with like the warp entity, and that was like sort of kind of a wild rule scenario. But they used to have things like night missions with like sentry details for the defender that could only move like a certain distance or like a certain way until they spotted an enemy unit and raised the alarm. And there was like rules for like infiltrating into the base closer before the enemy raised the alarm. They were really cool. And I've wanted to like try to like run some of those missions with like new armies and see how it goes. it might be kind of weird, but that's the point of novel play.
Exactly, man. That's the fun nature of the beast right there. Yeah, White Dwarf is doing really cool stuff. Even still, you kind of have to. And of course, at this point, White Dwarf is basically trying to get you to buy the newest thing, right? So current White Dwarf is coming out while Boarding Actions is still very hot. But last month's episode, and I want to say this episode, or issue rather, of White Dwarf, incorporates a lot of unique missions for Boarding Actions. And I did pick up the newest one. I think it's in the mail right now, about to be delivered to me. Come on, Games Workshop, get the shipping faster. But it does have rules for more Boarding Action stuff. I want to say, yeah, last month's was the Chaos Spawn stuff, where like there are these nodes of like massive warp entities like growing in the space hulks that you're fighting in, and this one has rules for eternally respawning waves. So one opponent is like the Horde army that is trying to overwhelm the other opponent, who is trying to get to one instance and complete an objective before being overrun, right? Mm-hmm. So
I love Horde missions in 40K, because it's like, you look at the artwork for 40K and it's always like these massive armies, and so like a Horde scenario really kind of like gets that feel of like, fighting against this numberless foe and trying to like prevail, even if it means like, the guys doing the mission are probably going to die, even if they complete it. It's just very grimdark 40K to me.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And that's something that I guess the impetus from this episode that I would like to impart on you, the listener, is to maybe consider homebrewing your own novel gameplay things. It could be something as small as random terrain generation, or something as big as a metagame like Riskhammer that's dictating how many points you're bringing, and is basically encouraging lopsided games, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things, like you could think of like your favorite movie, right? Like you could work out almost like a heist situation. Like I'm obsessed with the movie Heat, right? And so I'm thinking of like some scrappy Imperial Guard sneaking into something and like being all right, let's change this. So Heat, but in 40K. So you have the infiltrator rules, kind of like what you're talking about, but they're Gene Stealer cults, and they're and one player is playing Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum, and the other player is playing Gene Stealer cults that are undercover. And you're trying to find each other. It's basically like a cat and mouse. There's some kind of mechanic there where like the investigator is detecting Gene Stealer cult people a certain way, but the Gene Stealer cult guys are trying to rob a bank and get off the board with the money. So there's like a covert phase and then a shooting phase.
I do remember back in 3rd edition there was a White Dwarf where they had a scenario kind of like this. It was like there was no kill team back then, but it was essentially kind of a kill team mission, because they released I think it was a unit that was essentially the Dirty Dozen, but in 40K. It was like these Astra Militarum guys that had all these like wild abilities, and like each guy had like a skill, and they did this battle report where they were going into a Chaos Marine held landing pad, and they were trying to like blow up the landing pad so they couldn't like bring in supplies or something. I don't remember the specifics, but there was all these like stealth rules, and like they were sneaking in, and then guys would get spotted, and then they would like have to fight, and a lot of them died, but like the guy at the very end, he hucked like the melt-a-bombs, I think they were, on the landing pad and blew it up, and like pretty much all of them died, but they completed their mission. It was very like narrative and sort of cinematic, I guess, would be the word.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. But,
exactly.
And the other thing, not everything you do with like your 40K miniatures has to be well grounded in the 40K universe, because like some of the most fun games I've played have been some really weird scenarios, and they actually happened at Games Day Atlanta, which I think there was all of 2 of back in, I want to say 2003, 2004, not to age myself too much, but yeah, I went to I think both of those Games Days, and they would have these tables that were like local gaming clubs or gaming stores, and they would have sort of a scenario that they were running. And some of them were like, standard 40K. But one of them that I played on was this sort of free-for-all, ongoing, like it never stopped, just, mosh pit of like battle. And the people who were running the table would spawn in units. And then if you came up to play, you could bring in a single unit. Any type, points weren't an issue. You just bring in one unit and you try to survive for as many rounds as you could. And I think whoever survived the most rounds like won a prize or something. But at one point, my Space Marines that I dropped in, my tactical squad, was facing down Godzilla, of all things, because that was one of the units that the owners were bringing in. They would have like toys and things that they had like kind of doctored up to make them look a little more 40K, battle ready, I guess.
Hell yeah.
And they came up with their own rule sets for it. And it was just a very fun, just lighthearted and wild game, Alliances would be formed on the fly between different units, and then people would backstab each other. It was just very crazy. I can't remember everything they had. I think they had a Gundam. There was definitely Godzilla. Godzilla was like the heaviest hitting unit that they had.
I bet.
There was a lot of like pop culture things that they had made rules for. It was pretty wild.
That's super cool.
Yeah, and then another table that was at that games day was they called it Movie Marines, and essentially it was you played as Space Marines fighting like a huge horde of, it was either Tyranids or cultists, but the stats for the Space Marines were bumped way up to be on level of like what a Space Marine's like in novels that you read, where they're just like barehanded chopping through whole regiments of Traitor Guard and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
And like their missile launchers are just like rapid fire and everything. And that was kind of fun. It was very sort of tongue in cheek, I guess. But, you can kind of like go outside the bounds of keeping things super grimdark and just, have fun with the game, because that's what it's there for. Absolutely,
man. That is exactly what embracing the novel aspect or the novelty really is. Yeah. So, yeah, man, that's, I know that there are, even at LVO, there are novel things that they'll do. Like, I know there's one that's called, like, Kill Team After Dark, where the board is, like, neon acrylic, and it reacts, like, with, what do you call those? Like, black lights that are underneath the table and everything.
Oh, yeah. And acrylic will do some pretty cool light tunneling if you hit it right.
Absolutely. I can't remember what the name of the event is. What's up?
We got the Grand Narrative coming to Atlanta this fall.
That's right. Yeah, that I'm very interested in.
Which that sounds very novel. It's very narrative focused, obviously, because it's called Grand Narrative. But they have like all kinds of sort of weird missions, from what I've read, that they're going to cook up. I'm really hoping I'll be able to participate in that, because it just sounds like a good time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I feel like we'll get a contingent of Slam Sector out there, and we'll make a day or a weekend out of it, and get back to you guys with how it goes. It's a bit of a ways out, I'll admit. November I think is when it is, and that's
it's enough time to get fully painted.
Oh well, yeah, yeah, man. Yeah, it's awesome, man. I love finding the narrative and finding the weirdness and embracing the weirdness in the game.
Yeah.
I
think the closest I've done to Grand Narrative was at one time at one of the games days. They had this huge siege where they had like a U of tables, and the inside of it was the Imperial players, and they had like a massive citadel wall, and then the outside was, we were all World Eaters, and it was like a massive siege. It was like 10 40K games going on at the same time, and like the turns were just on timers, and so it was like move as many units as you can, but once the timer's up, that phase is up, and then they would take breaks occasionally, and like the Khorne people would go off and start screaming blood for the blood god, and then the Imperial people would go and pray, and they would like reward there wasn't CP back then. I can't remember what it was. There was some resource that we were like accruing. It might have just been straight victory points, but they would award it based on like who was like cheering louder or like screaming blood for the blood god louder. It,
Also,
it was a wild time.
that's straight up role play in there.
Yeah.
That's wild, man. I love that.
My roommate at the time looked at me a little crazy because I was screaming "Blood for the Blood God" so hard. I got a little too into it, but
Hey, that's the best way to do it, man.
yeah.
Some other things that I've seen, an LVO. Oh man, for the name of me, I can't remember what this event is called. But basically, you can bring one unit, one unit in 40K, infinite points. So you could bring a Titan and sit it down there, and I think it's like King of the Hill or something. And basically, it's just whatever the last unit is standing. So if you bring a Titan, everyone's gonna shoot at you first because you're a freaking Titan on the table. But
Right.
you could get away with maybe like a Gorkanaut or whatever it's called, right? Or a Stampa or something. And see if you can just outlast,
Yeah, that's kind of like the Godzilla game. It's just kind of a King of the Hill sort of situation. And
Totally.
It was definitely like anybody who came up to that table and they slapped down like a Land Raider or something, everybody immediately focus fired them. And so like I was putting down I think I had a squad of Burna Boys and a squad of Tactical Marines that I had painted up for that table, and that's what I was dropping, alternating them. They're low key.
So
no one thinks anything of Burna Boys.
Exactly.
But,
see, they're going to be looking for Land Raiders. They're not looking for Burna Boy.
I think I charged my Burna Boys into Godzilla, and he just nuked him.
I mean, if a Burna Boy's going to die, that's a glorious way to meet Gork and Mork. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, hell yeah, man. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap on the novel experience of 40K. What do you think, man?
Yeah. I guess the message is get out there and find creative ways to have fun with the game. It's giving you it gives you a baseline of how you can play it, and you can expand upon that as much as you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, play with it, break it, make it your own, and enjoy the rich stories and memories that come from that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for us on the 5x5 podcast. But on Slam Sector, we've got new content all the time. Coming up over the next week or so, we are going to have probably some more No Dice streams. Like I know you were just streaming the new Blood Bowl game, correct?
Yeah. So this Friday, I'll be streaming Blood Bowl 2 because we're gonna be doing sort of a comparison of Blood Bowl 3 and Blood Bowl 2 because there has been a little bit of, I guess, controversy over Blood Bowl 3, and I'd never played it before, and so I didn't really know. So now I'm taking a step back in time to look at Blood Bowl 2, and then so that's this Friday, and then the Friday after that, we're going to try to release a full-on comparison video.
Oh, nice. That'll be really cool.
Yeah, this Friday I'm just going to be playing it, having a good time, seeing what it's all about.
Awesome.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, they can tune in for that. And remember, if you enjoyed what you heard today on this episode, subscribe if you want to get updated when new episodes go up. Check out our socials at Slam Sector on Twitter and TikTok, and at slam.sector on Instagram. And if you'd like to participate in the discussion, join us on Discord at discord.gg/slamsector. Thanks for listening. This is Matt from Slam Sector, and Ryan from Slam Sector as well.
Hey.
We are signing off.